On June 30th, 1971, recovery helicopters were already circling overhead. The parachutes had deployed perfectly. The landing rockets had fired on time. Soyuz 11 settled onto the Kazakhstan steppe so gently that ground crews broke into applause. They ran to the capsule. They knocked on the hatch. No response. They assumed the crew was resting. Disoriented from 3 weeks in zero gravity, they pried the hatch open, expecting to congratulate three men who had just set a new spaceflight duration record. All three were still strapped in their seats. Blue-faced, motionless, the spacecraft had landed perfectly. The mission had been a complete success. The crew had been dead for 30 minutes. Story 1. Soyuz 11. Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev launched on June 6, 1971. Their mission was to dock with Salyut 1, the world's first space station, and live aboard it for 3 weeks. Nobody had ever done anything like it. They pulled it off. Every objective was met. Their daily communications were calm and professional. They conducted astronomical observations, biological experiments, Earth photography. They set an endurance record. They asked for more work to fill their remaining time. On June 29th, they sealed the hatches, undocked, and began the journey home. Everything was normal. The deorbit burn was clean. The service and orbital modules separated on schedule. The descent module, the small spherical capsule carrying all three men, entered the atmosphere right on target. The heat shield worked perfectly. The drogue parachute deployed at the correct altitude. The main parachute opened cleanly. The soft landing rockets fired at the right moment. Soyuz 11 touched down at 2:17 a.m. on June 30th, a textbook landing, the kind that ends with champagne. When the recovery team opened the hatch and found three motionless men, they initially reached in and shook Dobrovolsky by the shoulder. He was warm. They tried resuscitation immediately. So did the medical teams that arrived minutes later. Nothing worked. The men were gone. The investigation was rapid. Engineers found the cause within hours. A pressure equalization valve, designed to open just before landing, balancing cabin pressure with the outside atmosphere, had malfunctioned. It had opened while the capsule was still at 168 kilometers altitude, well above the Kármán line. In the vacuum of space, the cabin depressurized in 112 seconds. At that altitude, with no pressure suits, the crew had no chance. They would have lost consciousness within 15 seconds. They were dead within a minute. The valve had been damaged when explosive bolts fired to separate the orbital module during re-entry. A small piece of debris had struck the valve mechanism at exactly the wrong moment. The men were breathing normally at 168 kilometers altitude. By 167 kilometers, they were unconscious.
Story 2. Challenger. Most people remember the explosion. The fireball at 73 seconds. The forked smoke trails arcing down toward the Atlantic. The silence on the NASA feed. A teacher from New Hampshire aboard a spacecraft that disappeared in front of her students. What most people don't know is that the explosion didn't kill the crew. On the morning of January the 28th, 1986, Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart at 48,000 feet. Traveling at Mach 1.92. The external tank ruptured. The solid rocket boosters veered off. The orbiter was torn apart by aerodynamic forces, but the crew compartment, built to survive launch and re-entry loads, far beyond what it ever experienced, was thrown clear. It was intact. Data recovered from the wreckage confirmed that at least 3 of the crew's emergency oxygen packs had been manually activated after the breakup. You cannot activate your own oxygen pack if you are dead or unconscious from explosive decompression. Someone in that compartment, after the fireball, reached up and switched it on. Pilot Michael Smith's voice was recorded at the moment of breakup. He said, "Oh, that was the last transmission, but it was not the last moment of consciousness." The crew compartment reached a peak altitude of roughly 65,000 feet before beginning its fall. It took 2 minutes and 45 seconds to reach the ocean. 2 minutes and 45 seconds. In that time, the 7 crew members, Commander Dick Scobie, Pilot Michael Smith, Mission Specialists Judith Resnick, Allison Onizuka, and Ronald McNair, Payload Specialist Gregory Jarvis, and teacher Krista McAuliffe, were falling toward the Atlantic Ocean in a pressurized compartment with no means of escape. Challenger had no crew escape system. An ejection option had been proposed during shuttle design and rejected. The orbiter was supposed to be reliable enough that it wasn't needed. The compartment struck the ocean at roughly 200 miles per hour. The impact force was calculated at over 200 G. Nothing survives that. The investigation determined that the cabin depressurized at some point during the fall, likely from structural damage sustained in the breakup. Whether the crew remained conscious for the full 2 minutes and 45 seconds, or lost consciousness earlier from decompression, was never definitively established. What was established is this: they did not die in the fireball. They died when they hit the water, after the hard part was over, after the mission had already been destroyed. The Rogers Commission report that followed dismantled the culture at NASA that had allowed the launch to proceed despite the known O-ring concerns. Engineers at Morton Thiokol had spent the night before the launch begging for a delay. They had charts, data, and explicit warnings that the rubber seals in the solid rocket boosters had never been tested at temperatures as low as 18 degrees Fahrenheit, which is what it had been on the launch pad that morning. NASA management had overruled them. The launch window, the media attention, and the pressure of repeated delays had accumulated into an institutional momentum that nobody at the decision-making level was willing to stop. Challenger flew on a cold morning that everyone knew was too cold.